I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report.
I'm Stacy Herbert.
Apparently, the vampire squid is back to devour us, and only an alien invasion force can save us. Stacy Herbert.
Yes, Max. Well, the global financial deflationary collapse that continues to this day, almost 3 years later, apparently only inflation can save us, and inflation is impossible via the central banks. The only thing that could stop it is, here's Paul Krugman.
If we discovered that space aliens were planning to attack, and we needed a massive buildup to counter the space alien threat, and really inflation and budget deficits took secondary place to that, this slump would be over in 18 months.
Twilight Zone economics. So, Paul Krugman over there at the New York Times. All of the stimulus package, the work-ready, shovel-ready Keynesian solutions have all failed, and he's calling on an invasion from outer space to rally the economy to overcome what is essentially still bad behavior in the banks.
Yeah, and Max, you know, you read the front page of the Financial Times, and there's no more bonkers than an alien invasion as a possible hope. I mean, Paul Krugman's hopes of an alien invasion are no more daft than people believing that central bankers might save us, that they might save our economy. Move to curb Swiss franc's rise backfires, as you see there. So traders shrugged off new measures by the Swiss authorities to stem demand for their currency, sending the Swiss franc sharply higher. The franc jumped by 2% in just a matter of minutes as traders ignored the Swiss National Bank's decision to almost double the amount of liquidity available to the money market.
Well, look, the central bank is a force that resides outside of the economy, and it's there to provide, theoretically speaking, price stability and full employment. That's their charter. But they got sucked into the bank. They got sucked into the parasite that is the banking system. So now, since Earth is no longer available as a location to create a central bank, policymakers and Keynesian brainiacs are saying, well, let's just create a central bank outside of Earth, or depend on an invasion from outer space, aliens from abroad. Of course, some would also argue that this is a thinly veiled reference for the need to create more war, because people often say, well, World War II got America out of the Depression. So having failed to stimulate the economy by, let's say, imposing the rule of law and by eliminating parasite bankers and imposing true accountability, they want to go and send U.S. servicemen and servicemen from other countries to the front line and get slaughtered so that Paul Krugman doesn't look like an intellectual pygmy.
Well, speaking of war, an act of war has, of course, been declared over the past week. Chavez orders $11 billion of gold home. Venezuela's finance minister Jorge Giordani said that the weakening U.S. dollar, a near default by the U.S. government, and the European sovereign debt crisis threaten Venezuela's savings, and they will be more secure at home and in allied countries.
Yeah, that's right. The various gold hoards by various countries are not held in those various countries. We've talked at length on this show about Germany. 60% of their gold is held in America. Now, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela is saying, we want our gold, 200 tons of it, to be brought home, held in the Bank of England. And of course, the Bank of England is not the only person holding that gold. The custodians also include banks, such as J.P. Morgan. So it's as if Hugo Chavez watches our show, realized that the Crash J.P. Morgan Buy Silver campaign could be applied to gold, is demanding physical delivery of his gold, because he knows that J.P. Morgan and these other banks don't actually have the physical gold. They have to go into the market to buy that gold, but they're bankrupt to begin with. That means they have to incur more debt, which means that he's trying to collapse J.P. Morgan just like we're trying to collapse J.P. Morgan. So Hugo Chavez, welcome to the Gold Liberation Army.
Yeah, but the point is whether or not he'll ever get this gold back, because he's put in a request. But is this going to trigger other people demanding their gold back, other nations demanding their sovereign gold back? There are thousands of tons held by Germany at the New York Fed. All countries around the world store it in the U.S. Will the U.S. give that back? That's the big question.
What do you think?
Well, I think no. I think Jim Rickers is correct.
Yeah, I would agree with both you and Jim Rickards that these countries, and he's made a big story out of this, he believes that America should commandeer the world's gold, which would give them something like 14,000 tons in toto, and make them on the glide path toward having a post-Keynesian, post-fiat currency economy based on having the most gold. But you're right, this is a huge setup for global conflict.
So Hugo Chavez says this, Max, quote, "We've held 99 tons of gold at the Bank of England since 1980. I agree with bringing that home. It's a healthy decision." Max, the only way Hugo Chavez is getting that back is if he comes back with an alien invasion force.
Hugo Chavez, well, he's good friends with, of course, Oliver Stone and Sean Penn and Noam Chomsky. Maybe they can put together an invasion force, go into the vaults in the Bank of England, and liberate Venezuela's gold. At the least, it could be a great movie.
Well, Max, Hugo Chavez is not the only one seeking gold. Gold equals treasuries. The evidence, a stunningly high correlation of gold to 20-year treasuries from July 21st through August 16th is 0.89. Over that period, gold is up 12.3% and treasuries are up 11.8%.
I will resolve the conundrum that people are talking about right now on this show. People say that bonds and gold cannot both be hitting new all-time highs simultaneously because that would mean that inflation and deflation are happening simultaneously. Let me break it down for you thusly. The bond market is being bought up by computers. The gold market is being bought up by people who are fearful that the bond market is being bought up by computers. Do you understand what I'm saying? One is real. The people and the governments are buying gold. The other one is fake. A bunch of computers buying treasuries to make it look like the U.S. economy is not as catastrophic as it really is, and that can only last so long.
Well, the reason why people are going to gold instead of the Treasury, according to this article on Ritholtz.com, gold does not carry a downgrade risk, as do Treasuries. So this is the beginning. Just like I said, Hugo Chavez pulling his gold out of the Bank of England, this could set a run on the Bank of England and all their gold. This is also the same thing, the downgrade of S&P. This is the beginning of the rush out of treasuries and into gold.
It is a run on the bank, and to mask the collapse, they instructed the computers to buy more treasuries using borrowed money, which is only making people buying gold want to buy more gold.
Like I said, treasuries carry the downgrade risk, or at least they did until last week. DOJ probing S&P. The investigation centers on the alleged cases in which the company's analysts sought to award lower ratings on mortgage bonds, but had other S&P managers overrule them. The Department of Justice in America alleges that they began the probe of S&P before the downgrade of U.S. debt.
They're going to rewrite that story of the boy who pointed out that the king had no clothes. In this version, the king investigates the boy for having faulty eyesight.
Well, so I mean, yes, S&P did faulty grade these things, but are Fitch and Moody's going to what?
No, they didn't faultily grade these things. That $2 trillion error, supposedly, according to our buddy Peter Schiff, this was an assumption that certain growth parameters would be met, that there's no way in heck any of that growth parameters will be met. This is a straight up and down, straightforward, honest-to-goodness report. There is no $2 trillion error. S&P made the right call. The fact that they're now being vilified by the people that they made the call against doesn't invalidate the call.
Well, I'm talking about the mortgage securities, when they rated the mortgage securities that have exploded across the entire global economy. The S&P rated all of those Goldman Sachs CDOs, they rated them AAA. They rated all of those things AAA that they sold to French banks, German banks, Swiss banks, Italian banks. All those things blowing up economies were rated AAA by S&P, but they were also rated AAA by Moody's. They were rated AAA by Fitch. Those two are not being investigated as far as we know at the moment because it's only S&P that has downgraded U.S. government debt. Now, this is the question. People are going into gold because treasuries carry a downgrade risk, or at least they did until the Department of Justice sent a message to those who dare to downgrade.
I get it.
Okay, well, so let's look at where this message is going. Matt Taibbi, a whistleblower, claims that over the past 2 decades, the agency has destroyed records of thousands of investigations By whitewashing the files of some of the nation's worst financial criminals, the SEC has kept an entire generation of federal investigators in the dark about past inquiries into insider trading, fraud, and market manipulation against companies like Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, and AIG. So what do you think about this story here, that the SEC is the one that has deleted files, that is breaking the law, by the way, because according to the law, that they're supposed to save these files for 25 years?
You're right. It adds substance to the idea that there's a criminal racket because the SEC and the investment banks and the fund managers and the rating agencies and other aspects of government are colluding to create this unholy racket of price manipulation, price fixing, and extraction and siphoning of wealth for their own aggrandizement at the jeopardy of destroying society, which they're doing handily.
It also partially explains, Max, why Obama keeps on saying we have to look forward. Because, in fact, there's no way to look back. Because all the records have been destroyed. As Darcy Flynn, the whistleblower in this case, said, it paints a startling picture of a federal police force that has effectively been conquered by the financial criminals it is charged with investigating.
You know what's also remarkable is that the crash in interest rates, you would think it would spur a refinancing boom for homes. But what they're finding is that there's so much of a mess in the mortgage market that people who could normally refinance and spur the economy, because all the paperwork was fraudulently signed and induced, that this normal machination of lower rates to spur the economy is not working either. So fraud has just totally blocked any potential growth in the U.S. economy.
Max, Matt Taibbi goes on and he says, as one former SEC staffer describes it, the agency is now filled with so many Wall Street hotshots from oft-investigated banks that it has been infected with the Goldman mindset from within. And the Goldman mindset, Max, what is the Goldman mindset? Greed
and suicide banking. And bank until you kill yourself.
That's it.
That's the Goldman mindset. They're suicide bankers. The Goldman Sachs could be the aliens from outer space. They could have spawned a banking parasite there at 85 Broad Street before they moved uptown. And now they've made their way into all these regulatory agencies. They're the night of the living dead, or I should say night of the living debt. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Stay tuned. Much more coming your way, so stay right there.
As you know, Sean was 16 years old when he committed these murders. That's not to say that Sean Sellers should not be punished for his crimes. Sean is being punished. No rational person can deny that. Sean has been punished, is being punished, and will be punished.
But Sellers must be executed for the brutal crime he committed. This is a punishment. This is not vengeance.
Can't imagine what I could say today to cause you to have any mercy on me whatsoever. I know I didn't come here to ask for justice. I came here to beg for mercy.
This time, Ruby Smith? No. Ronald Worthen?
No.
And my vote is no.
Hi, welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Let's go to Tennessee and talk with Catherine Austin Fitz. who served in the George H.W. Bush administration. Catherine is also a former banker and is now an investment advisor and blogger at Solari.com. Catherine Fitz, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Max, it's great to be back.
All right, Catherine Austin Fitz. First, Matt Taibbi, in the latest Rolling Stone, asks, is the SEC covering up Wall Street crimes? Your thoughts?
Yes, because the economic model is a criminal model. So, of course, they're covering up crimes. They have to.
Okay, so when you say the economic model is a criminal model, explore that a little bit. In other words, the banking system itself is basically a glorified Ponzi scheme, correct?
Well, we have an economy that's dependent on war and organized crime, and you know, part of the profits of that organized crime is part of what's keeping the whole economy going. It's not just the banking system, it's every community in America. So let me give it this way. If the United Nations says we're competing for $400 billion a year of global money laundering, then the financial centers who attract that money laundering are the leaders.
Okay, let me follow up on this money laundering theme because Wachovia, now owned by Wells Fargo, which is owned in large part by Warren Buffett, has just been fined 2% of 1 year's profits for laundering $378 billion in drug money for the Mexican drug cartels. What about this settlement? Is it an adequate deterrent, first of all?
No, absolutely not. If your business model is dependent on attracting those revenues and processing those revenues, there's no way a fine like this can be a deterrent. If something, if something is part of what I do, an essential part of the business model, a fine like this won't stop it.
Okay, let's talk about the proportion of these banks. First of all, the banks in the U.S. and in the U.K., because I want to kind of talk about the U.K. a little bit. The GDP numbers that are quoted in both of these economies as the relationship to what comes out of the banking sector, it has grown fantastically over the past 25 years and over the past 10 years in particular from 5 or 6% 25 years ago to 25, 30, 40, depending on how you make the calculation, 50, 60% of GDP directly tied to financial legerdemain in the banking system. So is it fair to say that the GDP numbers that come out of the U.S. and the U.K. are tied directly to banking fraud?
Well, I think they're tied. You know, they include banking fraud, but they include sort of the securitization of the economy. So we're shifting much more of the economy into financial instruments that can be traded and represented. And you know, there's no doubt that the fraud is very significant. And part of the reason it's very significant is that a lot of the fraud is done with the intimate support and involvement of government. So you really have a government banking model, and a lot of it is done under the national security law. Okay.
You talk about securitization. More and more of the economy moves into securitization. More corporations who are reporting profits as a result of transferring themselves into companies that get into the securitization business. But let's take an example. For Goldman Sachs, for example, in the mortgage business. We now know that the mortgages, when they were originally offered, there was fraudulent inducement. Then we know that they took the mortgages that they sold, they repackaged them or securitized them and fraudulently marketed them to funds around the world. And then we know that they went into the foreclosure process, and Goldman and Bank of America and these other corporations and banks engaged in fraudulent foreclosures. So if you take away all the fraud associated with securitization, and securitization itself is now proven to be an inherently fraudulent business. I mean, the word, okay, first of all, so what's your thought on that?
Well, I think it's much worse than you're describing, Max, because you described the original mortgages were fraudulently induced. Let me use an example of one house. Let's say we had a fraudulently induced mortgage on that house, but let's say we also created 10 mortgages that were completely fraudulent. So I think the collateral fraud, you know, if you take the description you described and you add collateral fraud, I think it was much worse. And then when you layer the derivatives on top of something that's full of collateral fraud, you know, you're getting sort of exponential fraud. So I think the fundamental fraud process was far worse than you just described.
Right. So you have, on top of the three phases of fraud that I just described, the fraudulent inducement, fraudulent securitization, and of course the fraudulent placement of those securities into funds around the world. You also have the derivatives that were created on top of the fraudulent securities on top of that. So that adds to the Ponzi scheme. I mean, we keep coming back to this word technically legal. It's technically legal. But in a country like America or the UK, where the banking lobby has effectively taken over and changed the laws, repealed Glass-Steagall, brought in the Securities Modernization Act, and made fraud legal. I mean, if you make fraud legal, is it enough to say, well, it's technically legal? I mean, at what point do we say enough is enough, we need to take stronger measures?
Well, I think at the heart of the matter, Max, is not sort of banks out of control. I think at the heart of the matter is physical violence. Because a lot of what has happened, particularly, that I understand in the United States, is you have people who are afraid to say no because the result of saying no is physical violence directed at them or their families. I mean, we've had lots of people murdered and assassinated, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, yes, we have to say no, but the question is, how do we say no? And that's why, it comes down to shifting our money. But the reality is we have a force operating in the world that is completely operating outside of the law, and no one yet has come up with a way to stop it. We're talking about violent mobster operations.
So give us an example.
I hate to use a personal example, but I was a former assistant secretary of housing, and I had my own business in Washington, and I was helping the Department of Housing and Urban Development essentially run things clean, and you had to get rid of the clean team to run the housing bubble. And I was targeted, I was poisoned, I had dead animals left on my doorstep, my house was broken into, people tried to run me off the road. It was very, very violent, and it went on for years. So people who try and run the government clean or run Wall Street clean are targeted and literally, have to fear for their lives. I mean, people have been dying. So, it's a very, very dangerous situation. And the challenge is, if you have people who can kill and physically harass with impunity, how do you run a governance process?
Just for people who are unfamiliar, your role with the Bush Senior administration was what exactly?
I was Assistant Secretary of Housing, so I was the lead regulator for the housing area. And, it's very interesting, Max, because I left Washington in 1998, and I kept saying to people, look, they're engineering a housing bubble. This is going to destroy the country. It's going to bankrupt the country. And literally, I'll never forget it, in about 2000, 2001, the Soprano TV show had a whole series on HUD fraud. And my old college roommate called me up and said, wow, Fitz, you must be telling the truth. It's on The Sopranos. And I said, why is it that the Soprano TV show is more credible than the former Assistant Secretary of Housing? But literally, Max, I lectured and spoke in London, in Wellington, New Zealand, all over the world, in Sweden, trying to warn people about the housing bubble, and the investment community in all those places simply just ignored it. I mean, when Fannie Mae went down in 2008, I had been on the radio show in outside of San Francisco explaining about the housing bubble, for years. And one of the biggest investors in San Francisco lost over $1 billion on Fannie Mae going down, and wrote up a thing on their website and put it up and said, we had no idea there was a problem. Well, I was on the radio for years, the former Assistant Secretary of Housing, saying, describing the problem in great detail.
Okay, you mentioned Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They were caught committing fraud. They were bailed out by the government. Their liabilities are now the taxpayers' liabilities. We've talked about Wachovia. We've talked about Wells Fargo. We talked about Bank of America. All the banks committing massive fraud, securities fraud, accounting fraud. What role in the global accounting and securities fraud that you see in the banks, how central does the City of London factor into this?
Max, clearly the City of London is very important. And I would say in the United States that European investment interests have been controlling since the Revolutionary War, from everything I can tell. But the other thing I would say is we're talking about a model which is not just fraud. It is the model. It's the plan. It's the governance model. It's the way things are. So there's the official reality that has law, as you and I were brought up to believe it, and then we have a system which believes it's above the law. I mean, I literally had the Secretary of HUD once say to me, look, I don't have to pay attention to the law. I don't have to obey the law. I report to a higher moral authority. So we have the planet run under a model that's operating under a different set of rules and laws that we believe the law to be. Now, if you look at how much money's been pulled out of the economy globally, whether it's by United States, London, whatever, we're talking about trillions of dollars. And, I refer to a lot of it in the United States as the black budget. But the fundamental question is, where is all this money going? Because we're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars that have been pulled out and managed according to I call it a financial coup d'etat. But the question is, who's running the financial coup d'etat and where's all the money going? Because it's very, very significant, and it's a system that doesn't consider itself to have to obey the laws that you and I are talking about now.
Hey, let me ask you a question about the European debt crisis. French President Sarkozy and German Chancellor Merkel have proposed a, quote, collective government headed by an EU president. Your thoughts?
So what we're watching is the economic failure of centralization. The more you centralize, the weaker the economy's going to get. So what they just said is centralization has just wrecked Europe. So what we're going to do is we're going to do more centralization. Well, of course, that's the worst thing you can do. So, I hate to say this because I don't think Europe has a debt crisis. I think Europe's governance is being re-engineered and debt is being used to do it. So we go into a place, we encourage them to take on more debt than they can ever afford. Then we do a series of things that pull the income. Then we say we have a debt crisis, and then we start dictating to them terms by which they will stop being run as a sovereign government and instead report up to the top of the financial system. So that's why I call it a financial coup d'etat, because it's not a debt crisis, it's a plan.
All right, Catherine Austin Fitts, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Max, have a great day.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Catherine Austin Fitts. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max.